This episode is made possible by our generous patrons. To learn more, visit patreon.com/ink2film.
Welcome to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm James.
And I'm Luke.
And this week, with the help of special guest Taylor Zajonc, we discuss Stephen Spielberg's 1993 film, Jurassic Park.
So we'd like to welcome Taylor Zajonc to the show. Taylor is a maritime historian and record-setting deep-sea shipwreck expert. He's also the author of 3 novels, The Wrecking Crew, Red Sun Rogue, and a recently released thriller called The Maw. Welcome to the show, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming.
We're so glad to have you. I just picked up The Maw, which I don't know if you can see on our Skype call. I got it at Powell's. Beautiful cover.
That's an incredible cover.
Yeah, isn't that cool? Like the cashier commented on it when I was holding it. So
yeah, that's the first thing people remark on. I love the story about how we got that cover, and that's I had a bunch of all sorts of ideas that I thought were fantastic about how it should look. They tossed all of them. They handed it to somebody that was really talented, who just really got what we were trying to do, and I fell in love with it the moment that I saw it. I thought it was phenomenal. It looks kind of like those. Almost like the intros to those old Hitchcock movies back in the day, where it's these vivid colors, very blocky, really gives that sense of kind of tension and claustrophobia.
Definitely. Yeah, I definitely see that.
But yeah, so your novel, I started it today, actually, because I just picked it up, and it is about a guy who gets summoned to come investigate this mysterious cave that they found in Tanzania, that is like a Cretaceous-era super cave. And so when I read that, I was like, ooh, Cretaceous era. I wonder, like, did you have to do research into that time period? And if so, did you learn anything about any dinosaurs?
You know, I did research on really just every aspect of this book. Geology in that time period was a huge part of that. Paleontology, maybe a little bit less so. That really did not end up being the focus of the.
Okay. So there's probably not dinosaurs down at the bottom of that cave then.
Yeah, but I
no spoilers, but
no dinosaurs. But I come from a research background, so for me, it's a huge part of what I do. It's an integral part of what I do, and I really enjoy that part of a project.
Cool. So speaking of Jurassic Park, I'd love to know what your experience is with it. Have you read the novel, and when was the first time you saw the movie?
I read the novel many times. I had a little bit of a hard time placing when I actually saw the movie. I was doing the math. I was probably about 11 when it came out. Maybe it was a little bit early for me to see it in the theaters, but I do remember the cultural impact that it had. I probably saw a lot of the behind the scenes, how it was made, documentaries before I actually saw the movie itself. And of course, like any kid that age, just totally blown away. I was already a Michael Crichton fan. I discovered his books in 6th grade. I started reading them immediately. Everything I could get my hands on. And that was during the period where he was doing his most well-known work too. So to discover that author at that time period, and then, hey, there's these amazing movies coming out at the same time. It was pretty fantastic.
Yeah, your book reminded me of Crichton immediately, especially kind of the adventure aspect of his writing. And actually, a different novel is what came to mind, at least for the beginning, was Sphere. Have you ever read that one?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that was the one I first discovered in 6th grade.
Yeah, I thought of that because of the expert kind of getting brought out to this mystery thing, and I don't know, just made me think of Sphere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that's become a relatively familiar convention at this point.
Right.
It's the expert that's out in the middle of nowhere with no real idea of why they're there. I think my twist on it was that, at least from the beginning, my character feels like the odd person out, where that he feels like the least qualified person to take on this mission. He has no idea what he's doing at first, but that also lets lets the reader experience a super cave the way that somebody stepping into one for the first time would experience it, where everything as he goes along is new, and he's learning as he's going along. So, but yeah, I mean, I could. There's definitely been some comparisons made.
Well, I think they're good ones, and I think people who like Crichton should definitely check out your novel. But I think I'm ready to get into the movie if you are.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, James, take it away.
So, as we well know, Spielberg is the director of Jurassic Park. This film was released in 1993. I don't think we really need to dive super deeply into who Spielberg is as a filmmaker because we actually covered some of that in our Ready Player One coverage.
Yep.
But I figured today it would be a good day to kind of touch on what was going on with Spielberg in this era of his life, kind of where he was at. I mean, obviously, he's the father of the modern blockbuster, and creating this film and being so innovative with the different techniques that he was implementing, because he was, we'll get deep into it, but there is go motion, stop motion, animatronics, CGI, all of these different techniques being blended at like such a pivotal time. I just it's super worth mentioning that he was willing to work with all these different departments and try new things at this point in his career. Something interesting is that he shot Jurassic Park. In post-production, he was actually in Poland shooting Schindler's List. Two greatly different films, yeah. And I mean, in the behind the scenes of the film, they talk a lot about how he had to split his brain in two, basically, and be thinking about both of these things at the same time, and blows me away.
Creatively, I feel like that would be so difficult, but it's cool that he was able to do it.
Yeah. This film being so pivotal at such a time for CG and all of that kickstarted a lot of people into creating their dream projects that they'd been waiting on. People were quoted, this is what brought Lucas in to do his prequels of his Star Wars prequels. At around this time, he started developing them because they saw the technology was there at this point.
So we have Spielberg to blame for the prequels? Is that what you're telling me?
Well, I mean, I think we can all talk a long time about things that were wrong with the prequels, but they did do a lot for the technological advancement.
That's a different
of
show,
filmmaking. Yeah. I'm sure we'll get into it one day, and I have thoughts. But Lucas did a lot for CG filmmaking in the prequels, so it's still another stepping stone in this journey that I think that Spielberg started.
Right.
I mean, he didn't fully start it, but like helped to really bring it to what it is today. Just to rattle off a couple more, Kubrick started an ambitious project in AI, artificial intelligence, that ultimately Spielberg would come on to finish, and then Peter Jackson started working on a potential Lord of the Rings film. Because the influence from this film is just that massive. It was such a big moment in cinema.
Yeah, it was the moment that anything became possible. I mean, there's a before and after Jurassic Park in film, no question.
Yeah, so I caught some of those behind the scenes extras on my Blu-ray, and one thing that really stood out was when the guys who did the animatronics, or not the animatronics, the stop motion, like claymation stuff that all movies used up to this point, basically. And like if you've ever seen the original Terminator, like that's how they did the original Terminator, that kind of stuff. And they said they all had a moment where when they got a call that said that they were going to go with CGI instead of what they were doing, where they all of a sudden all felt like dinosaurs who had just got told they were extinct. And that I thought that was pretty ironic.
Well, and famously, that made it into the movie, right? There's that line of somebody in that moment, I think Phil Tippett says something about being extinct, and then Spielberg or someone else says being out of a job, and then Spielberg or someone else says, don't you mean extinct? And then that line is brought in for Ian Malcolm to give to Grant.
Right.
I watched a documentary recently about Steven Spielberg and learned a lot more about him than I had really known. He was raised by his mother, and a lot of his films kind of center on the idea of like a broken home, or like kids without parents, or kids without a parent, or parents going through divorce, that kind of thing. And I just thought that it was cool because in E.T. you kind of get the absent father. And I thought it was interesting that in this, I feel like he was putting himself in the shoes of Tim and seeing Grant as this like father figure for these two kids who are going through a divorce, through their parents going through a divorce.
Yeah, something that really struck me as well, with Grant, played by Sam Neill, stepping into the archetypal role of a father throughout the course of the movie. I mean, starting out, of course, completely disinterested, but and there's a lot of great moments of him being terrible to children, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But it's just not only was it Spielberg's experience, but I thought it made for some really fantastic character development.
There was a lot of smart changes to characters from what we saw in the novel to what we saw in the movie, and that's a prime example, giving Grant this journey of becoming kind of the surrogate father and coming around on how he feels about children and all that. Just made for a really interesting arc for him that was pretty absent in the novel.
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is a good point to just kind of jump into some of the story points. We're going to move somewhat chronologically. We will be jumping around, and we're not going to touch on every story beat, but we definitely have to talk about the opening scene.
Yes,
because it's incredible. It's what a way to start a film. Instead of giving us the mystery that Crichton's book gave us, he gave us the visual and the terror of the raptor attack. And I mean, it's to this day it's terrifying. And when I saw it as a kid, it really stuck with me.
Yeah, that was incredible. Throughout the whole thing, you can really tell that Spielberg cut his teeth on horror movies. There are so many horror movie conventions and ideas and techniques that he really just put into this movie. And I mean, in a lot of senses, it felt to me like a genre mashup, which is part of, in my opinion, what made it a classic. I had one other thought about this opening scene that kind of resonated throughout the whole thing. Was this almost seemed to be told from the inside of a Bond villain lair. The way that those guys are dressed with the jumpsuits and the hard hats, the type of crazy money-making plan that they have with breeding dinosaurs. I mean, it's kind of, it really is told from the inside of a Bond lair.
Yeah, I
definitely see that. That's funny.
And Muldoon, I think we open with some bushes or tree branches moving, but then we quickly get a close up of Muldoon standing there with his gun, and he's just got this dead serious look on his face. And from his face alone, you can tell the danger of the moment, right? Like, it is telegraphed. So I don't know. There's just moments of acting that stood out. I've seen this movie a million times, so I'm finding like little things, that maybe I didn't pay attention to other times. And that was one of the things for me. His face in that opener is just, it tells you everything you need to know about the scene.
Yeah, when the most prepared guy in the entire scene is freaking out, you probably have a problem there.
The thing is, we also don't really see Muldoon in this state again until the very end of the movie, or well, the end of for him.
Yeah.
Where it's like he's like clearly agitated, uncomfortable. You know that there's danger, like you were saying. He's terrified of these things, and he was right to be so because somebody's dragged in there.
Now there is I don't know if I want to call it a motif or maybe an ongoing symbol that I was picking up throughout the movie that I'll touch on more later, but I think it begins here with the gatekeeper slowly raising up this gate and then having the raptor ram it and then eat him. But I'll return to that later. But I just want to point out that gate moment and how there was a lot of weight given to it and the way it was shot and everything. It was, I think, very interesting in light to some symbols that I was picking up later.
Cool. So the next scene is Grant in the desert, and we definitely have to talk about the scene because Grant's being a dick to children again, or at least we see him being a dick to children.
It seems funny, that's for sure. Yeah, it's definitely a little over the top.
But it's effective, and I like it. It's still like a likable thing, but he's definitely being a dick to that kid.
Well, as the only father here, what was your take on it, Taylor?
Yeah, that was a little over the top. I'd be kind of ticked if somebody showed my kid what it was like to be disemboweled. I was also curious, whose kid is that supposed to be in this scene?
I think it must be a throwback to the novel, James. If you remember, there was like a group of children who were touring the site, I think from a school or something. And I think that's what's going on here, but it's not really explained, but I'm assuming that's what it is.
Right. I remember talking about how we would have killed to be those kids.
Yeah.
We also get a little bit of Grant talking about kind of because they're digging up a raptor and they're using radar technology to look down. I guess it might not be radar. They're using some sort of technology just to image down below the surface.
Like sonar or something like that. Yeah.
And in this moment, he starts to talk a lot about the idea of raptors learning to fly, and like there's a lot more. I think it's a lot more heavily implied, even a year on, right, or a couple of years on from the book being released, that like this was like a fairly leading theory. Because I feel like didn't Crichton somewhat lean away from, like he talked about them being early ancestors of birds, but like this is like Grant saying like this is my stance on it, kind of.
Yeah. One of the things I caught in the behind the scenes was that they had a leading dinosaur expert along for the production, and that was one of his like main theories he was a proponent of. So they said that was why they kind of leaned into it.
One of the things I noticed most about that scene was just the sheer efficiency of which it sets up story. Not only was it they mentioned motion-based vision for the T-Rex, which is of course an enormous component of the story to come.
Yeah.
The danger of the raptors and that they were essentially the most to-be-feared animal. Grant's relationship with children, which is, let's just call it strained. The fact that, and this was a really big one, the fact that these paleontologists feared being replaced by technology. I mean, they feared being replaced by this ground-penetrating sonar system, much less having no idea that fully fledged clone dinosaurs were also happening at the same time. But it just, the economy and the efficiency of which really the whole rest of the story was set up within seconds, I thought it was really well done.
Definitely.
I think right now, or right after this scene, right, is when we first meet Hammond, and he's the asshole who's flown in on the helicopter, and he's in their portable unit or whatever they've been living out of. I just wanted to point out how great an introduction to a character this is too. I mean, we get a lot of this in this movie, iconic characters, but everything you need to know about Hammond is on display in this initial meeting, right? He's brash, like he's come in with he's kind of reckless. He's come in and done something that is a little over the top. He's showy, but he's also still likable, and he's also still got kind of this grandfatherly vibe that makes him way more likable than he was in the novel. And I love when he says, "I know my way around the kitchen," when Ellie tries to help, like, to handle the champagne, and he takes over pouring it. And so even though he's this kind of out-of-touch billionaire, he's also showing that he's grounded in a way, right? Like, he's not used to having someone do everything for him. So he's nuanced, and he's interesting, and he's got that kind of Wonka vibe a little bit too, but yeah. I just love this intro to Hammond.
Yeah, dismissive but charming, disruptive but likable. What struck me too is right after we set up that Grant has this issue with children, along comes his benefactor, who in and of himself is very childlike. He's got this childlike sense of wonder, very, very open. So it's, right off the bat, those two characters make natural kind of foils for one another.
There's actually a line that was given here that I had never caught before, where Hammond says something about children are going to be just amazed at their attractions, that they're one of a kind. And then Grant says, "What are those?" meaning the attractions. But then Ellie answers, "Small versions of adults, honey." And she says it real fast. And I thought it was, and like I laughed because of the whole children thing, but I never heard that line before. Like, she says it so quickly. And I noticed a lot of these little funny lines that adds a really interesting levity to all these scenes that's also kind of absent from the novel, where it was a little bit more serious. Even though this is a serious movie, there are a lot of moments of levity too. That
humor is, I think, not only a Spielberg staple, but also something that we can see in a lot of movies today, where it's this, even if it's a very serious thriller sci-fi story like this, where we have dinosaurs coming back to life and eating people alive, that those moments of levity and those moments to chuckle, for whatever reason you connect to, those are easy ways to connect to a character. In a second, we're going to get basically the trio of scientists, well, a mathematician and two scientists, and their relationship in the movie, to me, is so much stronger than in the book. Because in the book, we'll get to it right now. I just wanted to comment on Hammond really quickly. Richard Attenborough, who plays Hammond, was the absolute right choice to play this man. Like, he was jovial and also like brought a certain amount of gravitas to it. You believe that he's this billionaire. As we get along, you're also like sympathetic towards him. Whereas in the book, I was like, "Fuck this guy," right? Like, I was just like, "I'm done with him. He doesn't know what he's doing. I don't know why he acts like this."
There was a scene right between these two, I think, where we meet Nedry, or am I out of order?
I think you're right, yeah.
Okay, I just want to mention one real quick thing about that.
Go for it.
I was on this whole character kick for the intro to this movie, and I was noticing how they introduced Nedry is also being really incredible, and how these character moments are just so brilliant, and it's something that I wanted to note as a creator, like try and figure out what they're doing here, right? And it's a lot of strong personalities in this movie. And Nedry is a clear example of that because he immediately is steamrolling Dodson. Dodson is just completely like under his heel in this whole conversation. He literally takes the hat, reaches over and takes his hat off and puts it on the table, showing like complete dominance over him. And then he makes him pay for the meal. And so like that character's relationship and also just how he treats people is immediately set up through his interaction with that one character.
I love that like shorthand for like this is who this character is that you can portray with just like an action that a character does. Like you said, taking off the hat, something like that. It's just really effective.
Yeah, means, motive, and opportunity are set up within seconds.
All right, so we're on the helicopter. Mm-hmm. Ian Malcolm is being introduced.
Oh, that laugh. I can't do
That's exactly what I was going to ask for. Is do you guys have a good impression of it?
Well, you just heard my bad one.
Yeah. I mean, it's pure Jeff Goldblum.
Yeah,
that laugh is pure Jeff Goldblum.
I put it on our Instagram account actually. I think in like a story or something. But it's amazing because I've heard it called the helicopter laugh. And it wasn't until I was watching the movie that I realized that it has two meanings, because I immediately thought of, oh, that's an interesting way to describe it because it kind of goes around and comes around, and I thought that's why they were calling it the helicopter laugh. Then I'm like, no, they're just calling it that because it's on a helicopter. But I also like thinking of it as a helicopter laugh.
Speaking of Malcolm, I think that he's a bit more creepy than I remember.
Yeah, he hits on Ellie a lot. He's brash, but like I don't know. It's like yeah, he's kind of slimy. You kind of get that feeling, but he's also just got that Goldblum charisma that you just can't. You know what I mean? Like you can't ignore it either.
Right. I mean, it's not that I don't like the character. I just feel like him hitting on Ellie specifically doesn't hold up very well.
It creates interesting conflict, which I think is what's most important, right? Because Grant also is this like he's a really interesting kind of non-reaction to it throughout almost the entire movie until a point later on where he finally says like that they're together. But for the most part, he just, it's like water off his back. He doesn't even notice it.
It's like a confidence thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like he's not worried. And I do agree it's a cool dynamic to give them. But I think it's just him being cool and knowing, and then Malcolm being too oblivious to really even realize. I think he knew, right, that they were together? Or do you think that he was just like
I think he suspected at least.
What I thought was interesting about the way that those two interacted with one another was, I think for the time period in particular, 1993, they really represented the exact polar opposites of what you could call like a masculine ideal, right?
Yeah.
Because you've got one guy who's a masculine ideal in the sense that he works with his hands, he digs up dinosaurs, he's extremely capable, he is generally soft-spoken, kind of more of like the Cary Grant old school idea of masculinity. Where on the exact opposite of this end of the spectrum, you've got kind of like this, high-tech, fast-talking, really, really charismatic guy. And I just think that's, I think that was done intentionally, right? It's that we have two different masculine ideals, and then we're going to put them through this really stressful adventure scenario, and we're going to see what version of this idea ends up being successful in this environment. Well, that was my idea looking at this anyway.
I like that.
Me too, yeah.
Because both of them were really very much rooted in American culture, right? Those two guys are both very, very American in what they are and who they are.
So something else to note that I think it's very obvious that like this is a thing that's being said here, but I didn't notice until my millionth time watching, like you were saying, Luke, is just that Grant, as they're coming in for the landing, when he goes to buckle the buckles, he takes two females and tries to put them together. And that's like a whole comment on the fact that like all of the dinosaurs are female, and then the idea that Grant ties them together, and then life finds a way. He finds a way to tie these two things together. And
nice. That's nice. I like that.
Isn't that? I can't say that I take full credit for it because I've seen it all over online and everything. But it's a big moment where it's like it's clearly like he's like female. Oh, I'm gonna tie it together, and it's like, oh, it's a funny thing. Like he doesn't get technology, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Other than not understanding seatbelts, like that's not really that far ahead of its time, is it?
No, I think you're right on with that, and that makes sense to me. That's a good observation.
I'd be surprised if that was not very intentional. Although that has happened to me on airplanes about 1 million times. I'm sure it's happened to everybody.
Well, yeah, it's happened to all of us probably, right? Like, yeah,
But then you get to have your Alan Grant moment and
exactly.
you tie it, right? All right, and now we've come to their landing. They're in the Jeeps. They're on their way, and we get our first shot of this dinosaur. And I want you guys to react to it first because I have a lot to say about it.
I mean, that's the sense of awe is so palatable with that. One of the things I asked myself walking into this was, why does Jurassic Park from 1993 hold up so well with its CGI effects when one of the biggest complaints now in 2018 is like, you know what, I just don't buy what I'm seeing on the screen.
Right.
So I think that he cultivates this sense of awe in such an intentional way. He's so aware of where the point of view is, right? He allows the reaction first instead of following the image with reaction. And, I would say that 9 out of 10 modern directors are not going to be able to stop themselves from doing the classic sweeping, impossible aerial shot. It's totally unrooted from the way that any camera in the real world actually works, right? Or what the average person's experience is going to be. But on the flip side, what he has is this ground level view of all the Brachiosaurus, where we kind of experience this in the way that the characters do, and I think that we also relate to it because who hasn't stumbled through a forest grove to see the waterfall at the end of their hike and then just stood there in awe of it, right? Mm-hmm. We don't, as a hiker, we don't get that beautiful sweeping aerial view or anything like that. We get to stand there and soak it in, and I think that that's what he did.
Yeah, and I guess my observations were that it does feel almost like a religious moment, especially with that score that is almost like something you would hear in a cathedral, and their reactions are just like stunned amazement at the force of nature that dinosaurs are in this moment, which I think there's not a huge leap to go from there to some sort of divinity being seen through the natural world. I did think that the CGI in this scene, while I tend to agree that all of it holds up, this I would knock a few points off. To me, I think it's because it's seen in broad daylight. I think just makes it hard, especially from a modern perspective of somebody who's seen how far CGI has come. Whereas like the T-Rex scene later that was shown at night in the rain, I think you're able to hide a lot of things, and I think that's one way to make CGI really work for you.
It's definitely the one that you can kind of tell the most, but it's still, I don't think for me it doesn't take away from the moment. Sure. Really, it's a moment with such immense weight. Every time I see it, it feels like the first time again. The idea that I think that you're right, since it's not obscured, it's in broad daylight. I also think that may have been one of the first CG shots they worked on. Probably all add up to it looking a little different.
Were you making a sly joke about the weight of the Brachiosaurs there?
I wasn't, but I wasn't smart enough to do that. Sorry.
I like it.
So for me, this it comes twofold for me. It's a very powerful moment for these characters, and like you said, it's almost religious in the way that the score rises and the way we see it is just this come to Jesus moment or whatever you want to call it. And it's interesting because the characters are playing God, and like, what are they saying with that?
Right.
But for the other thing that really strikes me is that the audience at the time in '93 is having the same exact experience that they're having on screen, because up to that point, the kind of CG that they had seen was rudimentary. They'd seen, a lot of practical effects in that. But just seeing this moment and being like, oh, this is the kind of movie, like we're pushing the boundaries. Yeah. And like it's amazing. It's a huge moment in cinema.
That's a great point. In past movies, it would have been a model that would have been stop motion moving. And that's not what this movie pioneered something different. You're right.
And it's that first moment, everyone saw it. It's everyone's like, what are we about to see? And then when they see it, it's not a letdown. And then, of course, we get welcome to Jurassic Park. And then the score rises and we see all of them off in the distance. And I mean, what an amazing introduction to Jurassic Park. So they sit down in this ride, and the DNA thing it's very efficient. It explains everything that you need to know. But for me, what stood out on this viewing of all this stuff was the way that I was talking about before. Grant, Ellie, and Malcolm, they become a unit in this moment, I think, because they're talking about, how did you do this? How did you do that? How could they have possibly done this? And then as the tour is going, they want to stop on the scientists, but it keeps going. And there's the moment where they're like, you know what? Screw it. And they all push, 1, 2, 3, push, and lift up the lap bar, and they all together decide they're going to get off the ride. Just incredible character moments, and like it really builds them up. And you can see their relationship. And I think it just makes for better relationship for the trio than was there in the book. Because I feel like there was a strong connection between Ellie and Grant in the book, but maybe Malcolm was like an outlier and he was his own kind of thing going on.
This is another really good example of just the efficiency of this movie, right? They could have just had them sit back and go through the entire presentation, and we learn everything that we're supposed to learn. But it's a character moment. Where they come together. It's also a story moment, right, where they show that they're essentially breaking the park experience. The way that it is supposed to be experienced versus what is actually happening are very different situations from one another. So yeah, I mean, it serves a lot of purposes all at the same time, and that was something that I really admire.
I thought about the power dynamic between these characters kind of being tested here too, right? Because we've seen Hammond is very clearly a man who is used to being in control and not having people tell him no. And every time they're breaking free of the system and doing something they're not supposed to do, they're having this power struggle with Hammond, right? Where he's trying to tell them, you're not allowed to do this, and they just don't listen to him. And that sets up them, not agreeing with him and telling him that his park is dangerous later on. And it really, the struggle between Hammond and these experts, I think, is integral to this movie, and it's already on display there. I also wanted to point out a funny line that, once again, I don't think I heard or at least didn't understand until recently. But when they're watching it go by, the Gennaro leans over to Hammond and says, "Now, are these characters autoerotica?"
Yes. See, I don't think that I realized that was a line either.
Yeah. I mean, animatronic, I think, is what he's going for, but he says autoerotica. And I just totally missed that. Every other time I think I've seen it, like I'm pretty sure that was my first time catching it.
Yeah, that was weird. I didn't think that I'd ever heard it before either. I was like, that's a new one for me. I'd never heard that.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the first points where we see that the way that Hammond thinks each character is going to react basically is flipped on its head. The lawyer who comes in as the adversary is immediately on board because he sees the financial potential. The three experts that he expected to win over right off the bat just get increasingly skeptical even before anything actually goes wrong. I think this is the moment where that starts happening too.
I agree. That's a really good point.
So they go into the hatchery here next, or the nursery, or whatever you want to call it, and I immediately thought of Alien and Aliens from the 80s, and I thought it was an interesting, at least visual similarities, except for it being a very bright scene versus a very dark scene in Alien. But just when that raptor's breaking free, I don't know, I wonder how many audiences were thinking like of a face hugger jumping out of the egg, right? Like, is this raptor going to jump out and attack one of them? So I think it creates like an interesting tension there too.
I came away with it with almost like the inverse of that. A lot of the way that they focused on it seemed to really be to emphasize how delicate it was, right? How delicately it was handled, how fragile everything was. But then when they realize what species it is, that's when it's like, oh, what have you done here? This thing is gonna grow up to be something that could kill you,
right? Yeah, I mean, I think it could be both, like, because to make something kind of the opposite is still in reference to something, right? Like, I feel like it is still in reference to the alien eggs, but yeah, you're right, it is very different still too. I don't know. I wonder if someone could ask Spielberg if he was thinking about the scene from Aliens at all, or if that's just completely a pop culture thing that I've come to.
I mean, could you have giant eggs in 1993 without thinking of Alien or Aliens? Probably not.
The scene that it kind of reminds me of, just lighting wise and the way that they're sitting, is the actual chest bursting scene. Is like where he's laid out and the way that it's lit from the top down. And they're like looking down on it. That's kind of when you said Alien, that's immediately what I would jump to, is like the chest bursting scene where it's like something's coming out of something else. So it's like, did they think it was going to burst out? Like, kind of, I could see where you were going with that.
Well, and it is
kind of what you meant.
that's kind of like red and gooey coming out of something white and pristine.
Yeah, so something else, little internet thing that I've seen multiple times. The first time you see Wu, as they're coming into the hatchery area, he's erasing. He's erasing on the clipboard. So the first thing that you see Wu do is make a mistake. So they're saying, like, Wu makes mistakes. They're acting like they're not going to make any mistakes here. And literally our introduction to him is making a mistake.
Right.
Just foreshadowing, like, kind of what's going to go on with the park. It's just, like, little stuff like that I think, whether intentional or not, lead to interesting discussion.
I'd love to know where that, if that was something that was it directed to him or what, how that came to be.
So I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention the actual raptor puppetry and animatronics are just absolutely incredible and hold up for me 100%. The cracking of the egg, the way that the way that she is breaking from the egg, and Hammond pulling that little piece of egg off the top, and then it has a little reaction away from him as he does that, and it just I don't for a second think that it's false. You know what I mean? I think that it's a real thing that's happening. And Stan Winston, I feel like we should definitely say his name many times throughout this because he was the practical effect guy. He was the person who was facilitating they were working together with the CG in order to create the product that we got on screen. And I mean, they created basically every dinosaur you see and blended it with some sort of CG at some point. And props to them and everything they did on this movie. And the fact that they were able to find a way to survive, they're not quite extinct yet in this movie. There's still the practical effects that are going on and it can be blended with CG. And I think to great effect, I think even today, that's where you're going to get your best looking special effects is the blend of the two.
Yeah, for nothing else, it's a great starting reference point for the artists to see a physical object in the space that they're going to start working on.
I think throughout the movie, whenever there's that animatronics, I agree. Like it's utterly convincing. Spielberg has tons of little tricks he employs to make us believe that it's a real creature. It's funny because this movie's legendary for kind of inventing the modern CGI blockbuster, right? But it's got some of the most iconic practical effects, I think, of all time. And famously the Rex later, the machine they made was incredible.
Absolutely. They were pushing the boundaries in every department. It wasn't like they were leaning on CG. Yeah. These people who were doing these practical animatronics that was the cutting edge, but it's crazy stuff. So we cut to the raptor enclosure, and still to this day, it's horrifying. It's unbelievably scary, where they're dropping in the cow, and we don't see the raptors. We just see them attacking in the bushes. Muldoon's like, we got to kill them all, just like he does in the book. And it's like they're setting up how dangerous these creatures are, and the fact that they're so smart. It's just it's such a great villain for this movie.
Yeah, I really always like what Muldoon has to say about him because he's he praises them, right? There's an aspect of the animal that he fears and respects. So anytime he says something about him, he's the one person that's on the Jurassic Park side of it, not the experts that were brought in, that seems to have a really healthy respect for what they're dealing with.
There's a really interesting filmmaking technique. I don't know what it is. Maybe you can shed some light on it, James. But something that Spielberg does here that I feel like I don't know how often I've seen this done. When Grant is first talking to Muldoon, he's talking kind of as a group with everybody else, and then halfway through, the rest of the group turns away and starts having their own conversation, and the camera stays with that other group that kind of breaks away, but we hear Grant and Muldoon talking still because that's the interesting bit of dialogue.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, I don't know that I could put a specific name to it, but it's definitely a technique where you're shifting a gaze, you're shifting the focus. If you're creating a scene, if you're blocking a scene, you're gonna have certain things move in the scene to draw the eye, right? And so as he's pulling out and showing that whole group, your eye is drawn to the other group. So you're looking at them because they're in the foreground. They're more in the foreground.
Right.
But as you're listening to their conversation and it's fading out, you're realizing it's not relevant. And as you're realizing their conversation isn't relevant, they actually turn. They finish their conversation, turn, and then it shifts back over. It's really smart filmmaking, and it's engaging because it's not just set the camera down and this is what you get. There's motion to it. He's playing with the viewers. He's playing with the audience. He's keeping you on your toes, I think. Very quickly, I wanted to hit on the fact that they come into like this conference room and they kind of start talking about the park so far, and after they see the raptors, and just Jeff Goldblum's mannerisms are, I think, what make Ian Malcolm so incredibly iconic, because just the way that he delivers the almost verbatim "life finds a way" speech, and then the way his delivery and his mannerisms. I mean, I don't know. I think it's mostly just Jeff Goldblum, but if he intended a lot of that stuff, it's genius. He's just like such an interesting guy. Like he's so eccentric.
It seems like he really brought a lot to this character that wasn't in the script, especially, and that was hinted at in the behind the scenes footage I watched too.
There's the introduction of the children next, and they run up and hug Hammond, and they're kind of setting out onto this tour. And as they're being introduced, he's in love with Grant right away, so he wants to ride with him. And there's this great shot, this like tracking shot, where they're in one car, they go to the other car. There's no cuts in this whole thing. They're in one car. Grant leaves that car. He follows behind. And then he asks him, which car are you gonna be in? And he's like, whichever one you are. And then he shuts him in the other one.
Slams the door in his face when he's talking.
As he's saying things, as he's saying things that Grant should be engaged by, because he's like this kid trying to talk about dinosaurs and books that have been written about it. But and then he turns, and just this whole camera move. The reason I'm mentioning it is because it's all to set up the joke, right? It's like it's the joke. You think the joke is slamming the door in the face. As it shifts over, we see Lex. Ellie has set up Grant by saying that Lex should go with Grant in whichever car because it'll be good for him. Right. So I think that's the ultimate punchline, and just like the way that the camera tells that joke is fantastic.
Yeah, that show was a lot of fun. Especially, it's such a perfect way to set up the relationship that developed over time. Grant doesn't come across as being a complete jerk either. I mean, the kid was kind of throwing shade at his book at one point.
True. Oh, true. Yeah, that is true.
I could see why he maybe wouldn't want to be locked in a car with somebody that's going to pick apart his work, but even if that person's like 10 years old or something like that, it was a lot of fun. Especially the camera movement really makes the whole thing, like you said.
I know on this tour, and this is something that I'm just kind of spitballing here after what you said, James, about the buckles. The line about I can't remember the exact way it goes, but it's like God creates dinosaurs. And then that line, that series, all the way down to women inherit the earth. I just thought about how all of these dinosaurs are female, and you can look at the macro story of Jurassic Park throughout all the movies, and the books is more about them getting off the island and starting to potentially create an apocalypse type scenario where they're maybe going to re-inherit the earth. And I just like the idea that it's an island of all females, who are kind of the starting point for that. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but if we're making connections, I can make that one.
I thought it was just maybe a fun character moment where she was able to undercut some of the gravitas that Jeff Goldblum is putting out there through his character.
Sure, and the sausage fest that is these all going on all around her, basically. these two men, like you said, almost kind of sparring with each other, right, through a lot of these scenes in their own ways.
Oh yeah, I mean you get that many really bright people in one small space like that. It's bound to happen in a story like this.
So during the tour, they go along. There's not many dinos to speak of until we run into the Triceratops. Which is basically the same thing as the book. They go down and find that the Triceratops is sick from eating a certain type of plant. And great character moment for Ellie. And I will say that she has a lot more to do in the film than she had in the book. And just the Triceratops animatronics, again, I have to comment on them. It's unreal. And by unreal, I mean it's completely real. It looks completely real. It's when you look at it, and they're leaning on it, it's breathing, and the blinking of the eye as they shine the light, it's so real. We kind of switch over to Nedry shenanigans. He's getting up to his scheme. He's finally implementing his scheme. And their relationship in the control room is pretty solid. It's funny stuff. Samuel L. Jackson's in there as Arnold. And Nedry puts his plans into effect, and the tour stops. Effectively, the other things are going on. He's grabbing his vials and heading off, just like the book. But the tour stops, and we get this incredible scene that I'm sure that we all are desperately wanting to talk about, so I'll let you guys lead off with this as well.
Yeah, right from the beginning, I said this was to an extent a genre mashup, and that genre would be horror. We we set up the rustling, we set up the isolation, footsteps in the water. Just, iconic. People still joke about that. Anytime I see I've got a cup of water and the water starts shaking like that, I immediately think of the movie 25 years later. And then, of course, the goat just not getting eaten, but disappearing, which is much more frightening than even seeing something get eaten in front of you. Seeing it just vanish.
Yeah.
And then, it just keeps on getting ratcheted up and up and up and up until the point where we just have that iconic moment of it coming out of the electrical lines, which are of course off at this point. And just to go back to why does this hold up from a visual standpoint? Point of view is so clear, where these characters are, what they're seeing, why they're seeing it, and then the way that the CG interacts with the physical world, right? Every time that footstep comes down, the camera has a very subtle but distinct shake to it. And when the actual attack happens, that CG animal is moving stuff around in the real world in a big way to the point where you can't tell. You almost have to buy it because you're seeing what it's doing.
Yeah, and we talked about the blend of the practical and the CG here too, because they had this giant robotic Rex, but then they would, whenever you see a scene where you can see it clearly walking, that would be CGI. And it's amazing because even now I struggle sometimes to tell when it's CG and when it's the big prop, right? And it's because it's so convincing. And the behind the scenes had Spielberg saying that he had a moment when they were getting ready to shoot, or it was supposed to just be a night shoot, where he decided he wanted it to rain. And all of the guys who made the robotic Rex were like, we don't know if it's going to work in the rain. And he's like, well, I wanted it to be in the rain because I think it's going to look better, and I think it's going to make more convincing special effects. And I think he's right. But it's funny because it did create a lot of problems in the shooting. Yeah,
just to speak to that, the massive animatronic Rex that they had, like you said, it would get, as the water soaked into the rubber that they had, it would start to shudder as they tried to manipulate it, because it was built for the certain weight that it basically was set at, and any more weight that was given to it, it would shudder and move around. And sometimes during lunch, there's a specific story that I read about where they were like eating lunch, and then the T-Rex began to move on its own because of the weight pulled it down, and they all freaked out because they thought, it's coming to life. This is also a great moment to mention to you guys. I'm not sure if you'd heard this before, but the film is 127 minutes long, and 6 minutes of it have CG shots. So that's just telling of what you can do with any sort of CG. It's the way that you implement it that's important.
Yeah, to build up the anticipation we hear before we see. They really squeeze so much out of that. But it was really wise too, just on the same frame as you're talking about where they'd shift from animatronics to CG and try to make that as seamless as possible. Even the paddock itself, they filmed the original daytime parts of the Nepali coast with all those sweeping cliffs and things like that. Night falls, they basically recreate the whole set inside of a soundstage. So because you've seen it filmed outside, you buy it inside. It doesn't feel like a soundstage, even though it is, because you've already seen what it looks like when it's all lit up in the middle of the day.
Absolutely. That was something that when I watched the behind the scenes this time, I was stunned to learn that. I assumed it was on site, but it wasn't. You're right. I have to tell a quick story. I mentioned that when I was a kid, I saw this movie in the theater, and I would have been 8. So probably even more inappropriate for me to see. But I was obsessed with dinosaurs at that age. And this movie marked the turning point for me where I stopped being obsessed with dinosaurs. So I think I had an opposite reaction to a lot of people because they frightened me so badly. And I can clearly remember this scene telling my mother that I had to pee. and her going like, what? Not right, like not now, like we're watching this crazy scene. And I'm like, no, I have to go right now. And I made her take me to the bathroom and leave the theater on the pretense of having to pee, but I really was just so terrified that I couldn't stay in the theater. I had to leave. And she found that out later when we were in the bathroom, because she talked to me and found out what was going on, and she had to like convince me to go back in and finish the movie because I was so scared.
Yeah, I'm sure you were not the only 8-year-old that had to go to the bathroom at that exact time. Seriously, that it was a scary scene.
Yeah. And Tim I obviously, Tim was me in that movie, and the fact that he was under direct threat was so terrifying. And it's funny because it left a lasting mark on me, whereas from there on I found dinosaurs frightening in like a weird way because of that scene and because of Jurassic Park, and I stopped being interested in them. I ended up being interested in writing, so that's good, I guess. But I wanted to be a paleontologist up until around the time I saw this movie.
So in the future, what I want to happen is when somebody's like, why did you want to be a writer? I just want you to answer dinosaurs.
Yeah, because T-Rex scared
dinosaurs.
me out of it. Yeah, scared me out of anything else that I was interested in.
So a couple of things that I wanted to hit on. In addition to this 6 minutes of CG, I think this is all together. 127-minute film, 14 minutes of it have dinosaur effect shots. So I think that 6 minutes is also inside that 14. So it would be an additional 8 minutes of just practical effects. So just to give you an idea of how
more often practical than CG when you see them.
Right, and just the idea of the characters are what's important in this film, and that should be the driving. Everybody walks in for the dinosaurs, they leave, they remember the dinosaurs. But the reason this movie stands the test of time is because of the characters and the adventure and just the way that you can connect to some of these characters' journeys. I don't know if you guys have heard this also. The water vibrating was a guitar string underneath the dash. Incredible. The use of an actual practical effect to get that, vibrating water. You asked me in a past episode, Luke, why I think that this scene holds up the way that it does and why it's so iconic and what it is that I think makes this scene so special. And I just wanted to talk about that really quickly.
Yeah.
This is a very long scene with CG, a blend of CG and practical, unlike anything that we'd seen up to that point. And the entire scene, there's no score that comes in, right? It's just the sound design. There's no score to tell you how to feel. It's just kind of what they introduced before they show you the creatures. So the vibrating water, the night vision that we're seeing, looking around, and then the idea that the goat is there and then it's gone, and then we look up to see the T-Rex swallowing it. The moments of heroism too, because we get Grant coming out and lighting up the flare in the iconic shot where he's, getting the attention of the Rex.
That shot gives me chills just thinking about it right now. And right. I've seen it 100 times or more, right?
Because the idea of facing down a Rex, and it's the size of these creatures, and it's just, it's so real.
The way it's shot, literally, it's from behind him, right? And he's in the frame with this giant creature, and it looks up at him and roars when he lights the flare. And it just is so terrifying. And the fact that he's in frame with it, I think, really sells the fact that, this danger is in his face right now.
Yep. And that's the last thing that I wanted to hit on. He lights the flare, he gets the attention of the Rex, and then the thing that I think cements this, and it's part of sound design, but it's the roar, man. It's the T-Rex roar. And in the document, I don't know how much of this behind the scenes you ended up seeing, but it's a baby elephant, a lion, and a walrus, some other creatures all blended together to give this terrifying roar. And it's the roar, man. It's the roar, the sound design, and just the spectacle and the danger, I think. So another little knowledge bomb. Ian Malcolm's character was supposed to, in the scene, run away, just like Gennaro did, and kind of just run away and be scared. And apparently Jeff Goldblum wasn't having that. And he, on the day, approached Spielberg and was like, listen, what if I also light a flare and also distract? And that's how I end up getting thrown and hurt. And just the idea of Jeff Goldblum saying, this, my character needs to be a little more important. And then, he lights the flare. And also, in that moment, you're like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And he lights it, he runs off, and he throws it and keeps running, thinking that it's going to chase the flare.
Yeah, that was so well set up. I mean, it would have been just repetitious if he was running and the lawyer was running. I mean, because as characters, they have such different motivations and approaches to everything. The the fact that he thought that he understood what they're supposed to do, and totally misjudged it, even though he was trying to do the right thing. It really says a lot about the type of assumptions that he makes about the world and the type of character he is. That really carry through. I mean, not only are they completely consistent with the character up until that point, but they really just carry through the entire rest of the movie.
What do you think that meant for Malcolm's character in that moment? Like, was this his moment of heroism? Was he trying to be like Grant? Was it? What do you think that was for his character ultimately? Like, why did he? Because he doesn't seem like the type to do this normally.
I think it was just a giant miscalculation born out of arrogance, which is the exact thing that he decried in every other character, right? He looked at something, he thought that he understood it, and that was all that he needed to feel like he could charge in there and do the same thing. Because he has a healthy sense of preservation throughout the entire movie, right? He's not going to be somebody that unduly puts his life on the line for really anybody. But he's also very arrogant, and that was the moment where it really cost him.
It's interesting because it's like he doesn't buy. It feels like he doesn't even buy into his own philosophy, right? Because he keeps saying how everybody thinks that they understand nature, they understand it, and telling them why they're wrong and what's going to happen, and then ultimately he. As you said, in his arrogance, thinks that he understands this creature and knows what's happening in this situation, and mathematically or however he justifies it to himself has figured it out and thinks that he can handle it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, from a character standpoint, I think he's somebody that seems to always start with the conclusion and then work backwards, right? If chaos theory is his central idea and philosophy and approach to the world, no matter what happens, it proves that chaos theory is right. So yeah. I think that this was another thing where, I mean, he started with the conclusion, which was that he knew what to do, and then worked backwards from there. But I think it also, I think that you're really right about, I mean, from a character standpoint, it's completely consistent from a philosophical standpoint of who he claims to be. There's a disconnect there.
I have to give a little bit of credit to him though, because I do think that there's a bit of bravery required for him to do this action. I think his arrogance is what gets him in trouble because he doesn't fully understand the situation and he assumes that he does. But I do think in order to even do what he does, you have to have a certain sense of bravery. And he does talk about loving children and how he has 3 of his own. And I think in this moment, he is trying to step up for these kids who are in danger. And he does say, "Get the kids." You know what I mean? When he tries to run off with the flare. So I got to give him a little bit of credit. You know, I think right. he is being pretty brave. I still
like the moment. I still think it's cool that he does it. Because ultimately that's the right thing to do, and he chooses to do it.
Which we talked about on our book episodes. Grant and Malcolm do almost none of this in the book version of this. They just kind of sit there while the other car gets attacked. So I really like this change.
Logically, I want to see if we can sort this out together. So the way that the park is set up, the T-Rex paddock is where the T-Rex comes through, right? And on the other side of the fence is like a wall almost, right? It's like, or not really a wall, but like a similar thing on the other side. And so the T-Rex breaks through, rips down that portion of fencing and steps right over it. And then as the scene progresses, the T-Rex flips over the Jeep or the Ford Explorer, whatever it is, flips it over, wrecks it, and then is pushing it, I assume, back the way that it came, right? Where the T-Rex came through the fencing. But now it's like a 20-foot, 30-foot, 50-foot drop, something like that. So, I mean, I suspend my disbelief for the film and for the sake of the story, and I think it adds a lot of tension. But I just want to know, like, what was going on there? Did they just say, like, nobody will notice?
I don't know. I think just visually, I interpreted it as on one side there's a fence, on the other side there's a drop-off. So I always interpreted it as it came through the fence and then pushed the Explorer off the other side of the road.
Okay. Right, but there was dangling fence lines that they hold on to. So
yeah, those were pretty long cables, though, right?
Reach across the road.
Supposedly there's like 50 miles of electrical fencing around the whole island.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, that could be the answer to the question.
Yeah, I doubt he could hold onto that cable with his bare hands with a child on his back later on when that car's coming down. But
Ooh, I have a factoid for you here.
Oh, I'd love to hear it.
Let's hear it.
The book Rise of the Superman, which is all about the science of human potential. There was a story about a skydiver. In fact, a base jumper that was jumping into the Cave of Swallows, which is that really photogenic pit cave where people are jumping off the edge of it and then down this pit cave, had a parachute failure, managed to grab onto a safety, one of the ropes coming down the side, one of the ascent ropes, as he is, as he's going down.
Wow.
So supposedly, I mean, he shouldn't have even been able to see the rope, much less grab onto it. I mean, he shredded his entire arm doing it, too.
Sure.
I mean, he was in some really rough shape. But, when you've got enough adrenaline in your system, you can do some stuff that might surprise yourself, right?
That's a great point. Yeah, as much as I want to pick things apart, yeah, sometimes superhuman feats are possible in those kind of situations.
Especially a Spielberg movie.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And if anyone would know, it's Taylor, so we'll take your word for it there.
So the next scene is Nedry and he crashing and ultimately running into the Dilophosaurus. Mm-hmm. This is another very iconic scene, I think, because of the practical effects of the moment. And the way that the Dilophosaur moves around and chases Nedry and is like playing with him at first. And then, Luke, you mentioned in another episode, he's so dismissive and then like, I can't remember the word that you used, but it was a great word for the moment.
I'm sure it was. I can't remember it either.
He was just he was kind of like, he's kind of making fun of it a little bit, and he's being arrogant, and he's like throwing the stick and telling him to go fetch, and he's a stupid animal. And then it spits on him. He gets his comeuppance, and when he gets back in the car, I feel like I still check my car every once in a while for a Dilophosaur sitting in the passenger seat before it spits into my eyes.
So far, so good.
And then ultimately, Nedry loses the Barbasol can, which that prop is incredibly well crafted.
Yeah, there's a moment. Just because we've been heaping praise on the sound design of this movie. I have to once again nitpick a little bit because this is the millionth time I've seen the movie. When he first is getting out of his car to go down the waterfall, I
think I know where this is going.
He slips, and when he slips, they do the sound of like I don't know, it's like a slide rule or something. It's like I don't know, it's a comedy sound, right? That you'd get in the old days when comedians would slip on a banana peel. It's that sound, and they do it here, and I don't like it. I don't like that choice to me because it does something weird to the scene, in my opinion, that I don't like.
Caitlin picked it up as well. She was like, "No way, that just happened," and I was like, I was in denial. I was like, "No," I was like, "Negative, that's not true."
Did you rewind it and listen?
I didn't rewind it because I don't want to know if it's true or not.
It's true. I'm telling you.
I mean, look. I don't know. I was like, I think it's the sound of his jacket slipping on the waterfall or something like that. But if you say it's there, man. I don't know. Both of you guys saying it can't be a coincidence. It sounds like there's a slide whistle banana peel moment.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of cheesy.
It was also, I feel like it's like a 90s thing too. Like you saw that in a lot of 90s movies. Like those kind of little sound effects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if any character had a comedy sound effect associated with his death coming, it would be Nedry.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But I don't know. It's like I think part of it that bothers me is also because he is obese, and I feel like this movie makes a lot of points about pointing that out, and us we're supposed to think it's funny, and then a fat man falling, getting that sound effect. I don't know. I know he's a reprehensible character, but like I said, it just didn't quite sit with me, as being something that I would want in the movie.
Yeah, I see that. So the next thing is Ellie shows up with Muldoon, and they're searching around. They see one of the cars is missing. One of the cars is in perfect condition. Very interesting and iconic moment. Mm-hmm. And then they stumble around. They find pieces of Gennaro, and then they find Malcolm. And they're talking about like, can we move him? And Malcolm sits up and he's like, yes, please try. Basically, they get him into the Jeep. Another extremely iconic moment is the vibrating water in the footprint of the Rex from before. The moment where Malcolm's just like, we have to get out of here. We have to get out of here. They jump in the car, and the Rex busts through just as they start driving away. And in a moment for me, anytime I feel like somebody needs to go faster, I love the iconic line where Malcolm is like, "Must go faster," when the T-Rex is like right behind him. It's just gold, man. I love that line. And seeing the Rex in the side view, it's just like, it's great filmmaking. It's taking something that you see in your daily life and putting a T-Rex in it.
Yeah, they did such a good job making the T-Rex feel like it had weight to it, right? Mm-hmm. Every footstep, it's the sound design, the camera shaking just completely sells it. It's crashing through down trees, which are splintering all over the place. They're just using all of these small, practical aspects to filmmaking to really sell this, to sell the CG part of it. I thought that was so well done.
Oh, that reminds me of something I heard on that behind-the-scenes documentary thing. The sound of the Rex's footsteps were recordings of redwoods being felled and hitting the ground. So every time it took a step, is the sound of a tree, like a giant tree hitting the ground, crashing to the ground, and so it gave it this really like thunderous footstep. I just think that's so cool that they can pull a sound like that and convince us it's a footstep.
So there's also the scene here where the explorer has stuck up in the tree and Tim is sitting in there.
Yeah, my first thought is, first off, I think it's a great detail that Tim is thrown up, and his main concern is he doesn't want anyone to know. Again, I think this is a brilliant child moment, and I love Grant assuring him that he won't tell anyone when he figures out that that's the problem. That's great. And then my other thought is this scene strikes me as just really oddly like contrived. The way that the car falls down the tree over top them. There's also a moment where it seems very clear that they could just go around the tree and none of this would be a problem. I don't know. It reminds me of the Indiana Jones scene, another Spielberg film, where he could have gone under the rolling boulder instead of running down the hallway, right? Like he had a moment where he could have made a choice to escape the danger, and instead he chooses to make it worse.
Well, he would have been sealed in, though, not to take us on a tangent, right?
True.
Well, I guess because, what ends up happening right down the road. That's true.
That is true. And not to mention, like, nobody's there to see Indiana Jones jump underneath a boulder. They want to see him run down the hallway.
They want to see him run from a boulder. They want to see Grant climb down a tree from a car? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, the part that struck me about this was, I think that any good horror movie involves kind of like this, the descent of humanity, right? Where all of the higher-minded stuff gets kind of slowly stripped out, and you become more and more a basic version of what a human is, down to the survival instincts, action, reaction, things like that. So along those lines, I think that this is a transition point where we start realizing that, Grant and the kids in particular have to almost start acting like primates in order to survive. Their go-to survival tactic is to literally just climb a tree right after they're out of any immediate danger. I also really struck me how well Spielberg captured shock in children too. It gets a little bit more cartoony as the movie progresses, but in that moment, they're just completely traumatized. And I think that despite it still being kind of a family-friendly movie, he does capture that in their performance.
So when they climb this tree and they're sitting up there and kind of just trying to, this is their safe space where they're probably going to fall asleep. I just wanted to mention that this is an expert moment for Spielberg because you need this moment, right? You need the moment, the come down after this large scale attack that they've experienced, and the moment, and he uses it as a character moment to build the relationship between the kids and Grant, and he uses it to give a reprieve for the audience for the coming events. And this is, I feel like this is something that a lot of movies today don't necessarily get right, because I feel like this moment of reprieve, this moment of like all that they have, where they look out and they see all the brontosaurus or brachiosaurus, whatever these specific ones are, they have this moment, and Grant, this is Grant able to enjoy the park again, because we don't get a lot of that from Grant's perspective. It's a lot of running and hiding and not seeing dinosaurs, but then they get to interact and he gets to feed one. I just think it's a great moment.
I have to make a kind of deep cut reference here that that scene gave me, and I don't even know if you're going to get this, James. I don't know how far you played in Dark Souls, the original. Did you play a lot of that?
I played more. I played all of Dark Souls 2. I think I only played part of Dark Souls 1, so go for it.
Are you familiar with Dark Souls, Taylor?
I'm familiar with it. I've never actually played it, though.
Okay, so this won't be for you two. This will be for our listeners, if anybody's played it. There's a character called Frampt that shows up in Dark Souls 1 towards the end of the game, and he's a giant like neck that's coming out of this hole, and he has this like weird head and mouth, and you feed him stuff, and you're basically just interacting with this like brachiosaur like head. And as soon as I thought of Frampt in this scene, I just couldn't shake it. That's what this brachiosaur reminded me of. So
nice.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
Oh, I don't. So around this same time, there's Ellie sitting down with Hammond, and he's eating his ice cream, which is a great detail from the book. And he tells this story about the fleas, right? And which is, I think, a great character moment. And I just wanted to call out a line that has to this day bothered me, as much as that's a great scene. Ellie says, "I was overwhelmed by the power of this place, but I didn't have enough respect for it, and it's out now." And I something about that turn of speaking about the power of this place as a metaphor to the power of this place as like the literal voltage. I don't know. It's just always it doesn't jive with me. So I just wanted to see, like, maybe I'm alone, on this podcast. So I wanted to see what your two takes on that line is.
Yeah, I didn't catch it at all. I think that I just kind of in my mind papered over it with thinking that she was saying that like the T-Rex is out.
Right. That's what I thought.
Oh, interesting. So you took it to be that the power is like out on the loose,
right?
When she says that,
yeah,
the power has been released, basically.
See, I thought she was saying the power of the park is out, like it's gone. You know what I mean? Like the power's out. Interesting. I wonder what the intention was there then, because I can kind of see it both ways. I don't know. People can write in if they what their takes are, because I'm really interested. Like maybe I'm the only one who's thought of it that way, but I always assumed that's what she meant.
I never took it that way. I always thought that she meant like the power of what they've been trying to control is out, not necessarily the actual power. Just wanted to shout out Attenborough again in the scene. There's a reason why he was picked to play Hammond, and I think this scene is it. Like it's the full circle moment. He's realizing his failures. He's realizing what he wanted to do, where he went wrong, but then ultimately he's like, next time it'll be better, and it's like. So it's like he's seeing his failures and not accepting them. So it's his moment to be like, basically, in the book, it's leading us to him not learned anything and ultimately dying. But in this situation, it's a little different.
I think he learned something in this movie. So I don't know if that's the same. What was your take on that, Taylor?
Yeah, I had a slightly different interpretation of that. I've always found that people in extremely stressful survival situations have a real inability to concentrate, to grasp the big picture. It struck me as him not actually understanding what had happened or how out of control it actually is. He clearly hasn't accepted the fact that his grandchildren are in such immediate peril. What he sees is because he's in such trauma at that point, that the ice cream is melting, and that's something that he can focus on and do something about. Because he's so rattled by the experience and can't even accept what his own eyes are seeing or what people around him are telling him.
Yeah.
It's like a denial. It's a denial moment in my interpretation.
Yeah, and I like that. And I think you can have that at the same time that the juxtaposition of him eating ice cream while we know Grant and the kids are fighting for their lives is still powerful in that way too, right?
Oh,
like
absolutely.
it's a scene that works on so many levels. It's really interesting, and I just also like that Ellie shames him a little bit, and he for talking about the next time. But yet there's something in his eyes, and that's why I wanted to mention it, because I think the acting, it's all acting, right? There's something in his eyes that tells me that he hasn't given up on this park, and that even though all this is going down, that he still believes in it, and he still believes in his dream, right? Like he hasn't lost it.
Yeah, I got that sense too. I always got the sense from this that there was going to be like kind of a phase 2 before it even opened. as we go through the park, we can see that none of the dinosaurs will actually come out to be seen. We can see that the velociraptors are totally out of control. Mike, maybe this is more of a fan theory than an interpretation, but I always thought that they were going to do another generation of dinosaurs, maybe try to go for something a little bit more docile, at least among the carnivores, before it actually opened. Because, no, you can't have a park charging the kind of rates that they're talking about charging, going through, and all you see is maybe some leaves rustling. You can't even see the T-Rex. So, but again, that might be more of a fan theory.
I like it though. It seems like it'd be a smart decision.
Well, in the book they talk about tampering. Like Wu wanted to make them more docile. So there's something there.
There's something there.
Sure.
So I just came to a thing in my notes that I haven't mentioned yet, and I just want to say it before I get past it. And it's funny because this is something that I feel like I wouldn't have noticed before we started doing this podcast, because I pay attention a lot more to differences that are on screen through the medium than what you can do in a book, right? And lighting is something that I think Spielberg is incredible at. And I wanted to point out that there are a lot of scenes in this movie where characters have beams of light, either like behind them. It's even like when The Life Finds a Way speech, Malcolm is sitting with like a projector behind him that is like shining all around him. Mm-hmm. And just how there's multiple times, this happens a lot with the flashlights they carry, where the one will be on like a table and it'll be like Arnold is like leaning over a computer and he's like being like backlit from this flashlight. There's just a lot of really interesting lighting choices with beams of light in this movie that stood out to me in viewing it. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about that, James.
I think it has something to do with it feeling unnatural, like it's unnatural lighting to make you feel like something's different than normal, right? So it's like the idea of like if you put the camera on an angle and it's like a Dutch angle, it's when the viewer sees that they interpret it as something is amiss, something is awry, something not normal is going to happen. So I think a lot of the lighting had something to do with that. Not to mention it looks really cool when you have like somebody backlit for a scene like Malcolm's speech or something like that, or to give a certain amount of like intensity to how scary it is when all the lights are out and there's dinosaurs out there and there's the only source of light they have is from directly behind Arnold's.
Yeah, it's just to chime in here a little bit. It's Spielberg is a director who paints with light, right? The light shows you who you're supposed to focus on. If a character is going into a particularly compelling monologue about something, there's probably some kind of lighting element which is highlighting them. It's not just the way that they're framed; it's the way that they're lit too. He's a master at that.
Yeah, he's definitely got an eye for it. So the kids and Grant start going on their journey again, and they run into a stampede, and they have to avoid it. And this is another situation where you can really see what they're able to do, which was not able to be done before, which is have a stampede of dinosaurs. You can see their feet all the way across, and it's great to see them running away from it and hiding, and this leads them to the fence, which is not electrified right now because all the power is out because of Nedry, and they have to climb it.
Yeah, and this scene happens at the same time that we see Ellie going to the shed to try and reactivate the power, and the way it cuts in between the two, right, where she's going down one at a time, turning on the fence, and we see the sirens come on, and we see her making progress, and man, that's just something you can only do in film, right? Like, it's so hard to do something like that in a book, at least in the same way. I also just wanted to note that when Grant first goes up to the fence, I saw this on the internet. I can't take full credit for it, but someone said that it's the greatest dad joke ever told, and it's him pretending like he's getting shocked by the fence and then turning around and making the face at the kids. I just like the idea of that being a dad joke.
Yeah, he seems to be the only one that finds that funny.
Which I think is essential for dad jokes, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, especially considering what happens here in a second. They climb the fence, and as they get up there, as you said, Ellie's flicking all the breakers. Everybody else is off, and Tim's having some trouble getting down. and they're telling him to jump. And I thought this was funny because they were telling him to jump, and they were like 50 feet away from the fence, and they were like, just jump. And Grant had his arms out like he would catch him. But then as time goes on, he gets closer to the fence, and Ellie gets the power back on, and Tim goes flying through the air.
But it's weird because when he catches him, he's far away from the fence again. It's another like I don't know if it's an editing thing or what, but it felt to me like he was directly beneath him, and then he goes shooting off, and somehow he catches him like 15 feet away from the fence. I don't know. I'm nitpicking again.
Right. It's just one of those things where it's like unless you've seen it 100 times, you might not even notice it.
Probably don't even notice. Yeah.
That's the point. I think it was Scorsese that said, hopefully I'm not misquoting, but he said like, if there's an error like that you notice in the scene, then the scene isn't working. Right. So it's like those little things that turn up. Like if those are the things that you're noticing in the scene, then they're not doing their job correctly.
Right. Because you're not swept up in it enough.
Right.
So you're noticing stuff like that, or you've seen it 1,000 times.
I'm a little surprised that this made it into the final cut for a couple of reasons. On one hand, I think it's fantastic storytelling to have two characters that you're both rooting for with objectives that are essentially in competition. Right. Ellie wants to turn the fence back on. Of course she does. But she has no idea how this is going to affect Grant and those two kids. You know, I'm also generally speaking a fan of outlining the worst case scenario and then actually making that happen in the story rather than just constantly have threats that don't pay off. But on the flip side, they put 10,000 volts through a kid.
Yeah.
So
yeah, he should be dead.
I was a little surprised it made it in.
Yeah, it seems like it just takes like one expert to kind of go, hey, he'd totally be dead, right? Like he wouldn't be fine, in the next scene.
But his hair is kind of sticking up.
And yeah, he would be a a bug that flew into a bug zapper.
Yeah, it's pretty common when like the resurrection of the hero, right? The hero gets killed or something like that, and they do CPR or something happens and they rise again. And I mean, it's pretty classic storytelling. But again, it's a little surprising to see it happen to a kid where they actually have to do CPR on him to get him breathing again.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but I like that though. I don't know, like it's surprising, I guess, also to see it happen to a kid. I agree that it stretches credibility a little bit, but. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting too. So I guess I'm okay with it being in there. This is the raptor showdown with Ellie. The reveal is so good. Yeah. Where she's on the radio and she's saying like power's back on or whatever, and the raptor just bursts through that piping or whatever over her shoulder, and it's like a "Here's Johnny" moment from The Shining or something.
It's the biggest jump for sure. It's
startling, right? Yeah.
It's great. Yeah. And then her battle with the raptor as she tries to escape, and then she eventually reaches Grant, and he's like talking to her about the raptors or whatever, and she's like, well, there's only two left unless they learn how to open doors.
Yeah.
Yeah. So of course it's gonna open the door immediately.
Yeah.
We do also. I want to mention the Muldoon stuff because that all happens at this time too. This is the first time where I noticed that its chronology is a little weird for me. Because he tells Ellie, run, because you won't make. No, he says we won't make it because we're being hunted, right? And he tells her to run. And then she goes in there. Her turning on the power and everything that happens with Grant, all of that goes down before she leaves. And it's not until she leaves the shed that we actually see what happened with Muldoon when he was like pursuing that raptor. So it almost feels like it was supposed to it's like going back in time to show us what happened, but. The movie never does that anywhere else, so it just felt like something weird with the editing to me. Does that make sense? Like the scene felt out of place, like it should have happened earlier.
Yeah, it was definitely maybe meant to be intercut or something like that, and because the chronology is slightly off. But at that point, part of the reason I can forgive that is that everybody's having a pretty individual experience at that time. They're as split up as they'll ever be.
Yeah.
And then when you have that many characters and that many different situations of peril, I'm okay with people kind of experiencing time in slightly different ways. You know what I mean?
I agree.
It still all holds together pretty well.
Yeah.
It's off, but it's not distracting, at least to me.
Yeah, and to James's point, it's one of those things that I'm probably only noticing because, like I said, millionth time seeing it. I do, but the other bonus is you get to pick up little symbols and things that you don't think about. And I want to also shout out something that so when I referenced that gate thing earlier, right, for the raptors, it's to reference this thing that I picked up on this movie, and that's that I believe there's very strong symbols and motifs and allusions to hell and to demons and to Satan surrounding these raptors. And the first, I think, jumpstart to that is when we see the mother raptor looking over the branch and the snake crawls into frame. And when I think of the snake, I think of the Garden of Eden, and I think of the story of the Bible where Satan tempts humanity, right, with the forbidden fruit, which you can then extrapolate out to the forbidden fruit of science and for playing God and all that stuff too, right? I immediately thought of the raptors as these demonic figures. The gate opening reminds me like gates of hell, letting loose the demons. And then later on in the scene we're about to get, when the two raptors first come into the kitchen together, there's a scene where they're standing side by side and the two heads kind of nip at each other. And I immediately thought of Cerberus. And yeah, so anyway, I made this big, strong, like big multi-part symbol thing that I have never noticed before, but I came up with watching this time. What do you think? Maybe I'm full of shit, but it was something I thought I was picking up on.
It's pretty interesting. I never thought of anything like that.
I'm trying to think if there's many other Spielberg movies that lean heavily on religious allegory in a visual sense. It's not one of his most common tricks at any rate.
Well, I mean, you could look at Indiana Jones as more on the nose with all the religion, so he's not shy about using it. But yeah, I think it's more because it's very subtle. I think it's
yeah, I meant
it's if it's there at all,
like an allegorical sense, right? Because like you said, Indiana Jones, that is the story.
But I don't know. I just like the idea of these raptors as being almost a demonic force, but not really, not like literally, but like in just a kind of a symbolic way. And I don't know, like I think that snake is a very interesting, deliberate choice, right? And why else is it there if not to evoke, I don't know, the most famous snake of all time, right?
I like the read. I think it's interesting. But what I get from the snake is a reptile or something that could potentially have lived in the same era, kind of like the two species meeting, and like the idea that like they're in the same time frame. Now in our time, that's what I got from the snake thing. But I do like the idea. I like the whole thing that you extrapolated out, like the Cerberus thing. I see that with the raptors.
And the forbidden fruit is knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And therefore science. So I think a Garden of Eden allegory. I don't know.
I like it. I mean, it's a valid point. I definitely think it's.
I stand by it. Whether or not it's there, I don't know. But it makes me happy. I like to pretend it is there at least.
So then we get the kitchen scene, which you were just alluding to, which is probably, in my opinion, the second best scene in the whole movie, and that's saying something because the first best scene is amazing. This scene is incredible. And the puppetry in here mixed with the CG again is amazing. And I would argue, although the T-Rex attack is scary, the idea of these smaller, more intelligent creatures after you is even scarier. What did you guys think of the scene?
Yeah, the T-Rex scene. That really evokes such a sense of awe. With this, it's just threat, right? Going back to the beginning. The first scene with Grant, he doesn't talk about the T-Rex. He talks about how the Velociraptor will chase you down and split you open. So, I think that this by far, for me at least, was the tensest scene in the entire movie. Plus, it's really the kids that are in the most amount of danger. And at this point too, we get to see how far these kids have come too, where they're working together. They know that they can't outrun these animals at all. So what they have to do is they have to be more clever than the smartest dinosaur in the entire park. So that was really fun to see, where they just didn't have much hesitation. They weren't cowering in fear. They were just, it was just one half step ahead of the raptors, just for the entire time. Really, I mean, it kept me on the edge of my seat, even watching it for probably the 10th time.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I also just want to shout out, I think, something I noticed that Spielberg was doing, I think, to sell these effects. There's multiple times where we see a raptor come up to glass and then exhale, and the way its exhale fogs up the glass, right? It's that little detail. Same thing with like the pupil shrinking in the Rex when the flashlight gets pointed into it. All these little things sell us that it's real, right? And I thought of another little moment when Tim looks over and he sees the raptor's big claw tapping on the ground as it's walking. And just like those little details sell it in such a way that I think so many other like directors miss these little things that you can do to just really sell stuff.
Yeah, because those aren't the kind of things that you can just kind of insert in post, right? You have to walk into it knowing exactly what you're going to film, what you want to get out of it, and then carry it all the way through into post-production.
Yeah, and to reference another project that we've covered, Luke, Peter Jackson, famously for his Lord of the Rings trilogy, he had storyboarded everything, and he had taken little lipstick cams and done all of his shots he wanted with miniature. He had everything planned out going into the production. Didn't know this until this viewing of the special features. I think that he got it from Spielberg, because Spielberg did all of that, completely storyboarded, knew all the shots he wanted, did everything with miniatures and a lipstick cam, got all the shots he wanted, basically shot the movie Peter Jackson did the same thing, basically shot the movie before going on set and shooting the movie. And I thought that was
wild.
I mean, that amount of planning leads to, like you guys were saying, these things that you can't just like, that's not something you wing or something you improvise. That's planned, that's built in. And it adds a lot.
Yeah, another movie created like that, Mad Max Fury Road.
Yeah.
Great film.
Another really good example of all the planning that you put into the front end, you're going to get right back out at the back end.
Agreed. Yeah. So during this kitchen scene, the kids outsmart the raptors, and they're able to get away and meet up with Grant and Ellie, and they're all kind of in the air ducts and everything. And actually, before they go into the air ducts, they get into the control room and get all the power back on and everything back on. In a good moment for Lex. I like that her character was able to do that, which is different than anything she gets to do in the book.
Yeah.
So they escape that room, and they're having to crawl up into the scaffolding because the raptors have gotten in, and they end up in like the main atrium area with the fossils. As they're getting down, they're climbing onto the fossils, the bones, and the raptors attack, and they like jump onto the bones as well, and they're all swinging around and flying and stuff, and they come down to the ground. They're being surrounded by raptors. Then we get the T-Rex Machina. where the T-Rex jumps in at the last second and snags the raptor that's jumping to get all of them, and in what is a very exciting scene. Granted, it's kind of Deus Ex Machina ish, but the Rex grabs the raptor, thrashes him about, and saves them effectively, and then kills the other raptor and does the famous dino roar, the famous T-Rex roar, and the banner falls, and that moment gets me every time. That shot, I know that Spielberg probably was just like, I have to make this the most iconic that I possibly can, but it's so iconic, the banner falling. That leads us up basically to the end of the film. They're able to escape effectively after that. They get onto the helicopters, and as they leave, they see the birds flying, and Grant kind of holding the kids, comforting them, and Ellie sees that, and you can see their relationship. And we didn't talk a lot about what Malcolm did, but Malcolm also made it off this time instead of dying as he did in the book.
Right. Well, maybe did in the book.
Potentially.
it's said to do. I'd love to hear your take on these last few scenes here, Taylor.
One of the things that struck me is how abruptly it ended. Right? I mean, we have that final kind of incredible, iconic moment. T-Rex in the middle of the, standing on top of the bones of its ancestors as the banner flutters down. They hop in the Jeep. They're at the helicopter. There's a guy driving them out there, and which made me kind of wonder. It's like, where was this guy the whole time? Did he just sleep? Did he sleep through the fall of Jurassic Park?
He's always in the Jeep. He's always hanging out in the Jeep.
Yeah. That was the vet, right? I think that's who it was.
Oh,
Was it? Yeah, yeah.
I didn't just.
He was a little bit more of a character in the book.
He seemed to have missed most of the action, though. That's what struck me. At any rate, and then they're just they're a little bit reflective as they, fly away from the island. But that's really it. I mean, on one hand, it's been such a journey, and Spielberg built it up so much that the fact that it's abrupt doesn't take away from how satisfying it is. And maybe we don't have to have a, well, what did we learn conversation, because everybody kind of knows. We've been having that conversation throughout the whole movie. For a movie that borrows as much as it does from horror, it struck me as having a very, very conventional adventure, like family adventure movie ending.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I do think it's nice that they get that moment of reflection of peace and of kind of like decompression after the craziness that's been happening. And the movie almost ends on the score as we watch these birds flying, right? So it creates a really interesting dynamic to like what we just saw of like the insanity that was going down. But you're right. I mean, it is fairly conventional in that sense. And I think that maybe can be okay for this film, because I think it's fitting for the kind of movie it is, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's definitely fitting. But with the exception of Grant maybe moving into this archetypal father role and Hammond being thoroughly humbled by the experience, how much has everybody kind of changed as characters? That was something that, that's something that stuck with me.
Yeah. I think the kids grew, and I think Grant grew. But I agree. I don't know. Hammond, I'm sure, has some lessons that he's learned. I don't know that he's fully learned his lesson.
But how much even did the kids grow, right? Because we see them in that exact same pose of falling asleep on Grant as we did in the tree.
Well, I mean, I think that like they had their moments though too, right? Like honestly, Lex had more moments than Tim, but Lex had the moment where she kind of outsmarted the Raptors, and then also worked on the software on the computer.
Lex overcame her fear, I think, would be one thing for her, because she initially is just terrified out of her mind, and she was able to find bravery. But yeah, I mean, I think their arcs are all kind of minor and kind of beside the point. I think the major arc is Grant and his relationship to children, and then Hammond, I think, and him being humbled by what happens. But I do want to touch on a couple things in those previous scenes real quick. I in the post in the behind the scenes footage, they talked about how this scene was very different in the original script. The Raptors were going to get impaled by falling bones, and that was going to be how they were going to be killed. So different kind of Deus Ex Machina. And then Spielberg decided that he loved the early footage they were getting too much of whenever the Rex was on screen, and he said, we got to bring him back. He's the main character of this movie. He's got to come back. Or she, sorry, god damn it. Did it again. She's got to come back. What's funny, there's a little thing in there that I thought was funny, where this guy who says, okay, that's great, but how do they get there? Like, how does she get there? And Spielberg says she comes in from this part of the frame or whatever. And the guy was laughing and saying Spielberg was just answering how the Rex comes into frame into his movie, whereas he meant, how does it get into this room?
Right. It's not very clear whether the T-Rex could have cleared the opening there.
Yeah, I think it could. I could just barely see it. And
Right.
part of it is I think I can see it because I was watching it in Blu-ray and I could see the door, whereas I think originally it was very unclear like how that Rex got into that room.
Yeah. Again, I think it just basically comes back down to like, is it an effective moment in cinema? You know what I mean? Does it work? And then if it does, then the audiences will buy in. And
it lays the groundwork for a lot of these other movies, because I think if you look at like Jurassic World is a clear example of where the dinosaurs themselves are almost more integral characters than just like creatures, right? Like they're characters themselves. And that's a motif I think that's been carried on to all these other movies, and it's funny to think about how it was the last second edition.
I had no idea that it was the last second edition. I mean, it's just such an iconic moment. It never would have even occurred to me to wonder whether it could fit through the door or not. Right? It's just my suspension of disbelief at that point was so complete that I was just on board for all the awesome stuff I was watching.
So, did you guys have any other wrapping up thoughts?
I've got just two real brief thoughts here. First, I mean, rewatching this, you can just see why big action adventure films are divided into a before Jurassic Park and after Jurassic Park eras. I mean, it fundamentally shifted how movies like that were made. The other thing that I would say is, I think that it would be, worth revisiting as we go into more Jurassic World movies and more big budget, high CG blockbusters, just to see when they didn't have a whole lot to work with in terms of computing power, when they couldn't just throw CG horsepower at a visual effects problem. That forced Spielberg to make this movie in a way that was so intentional, right? Down to the smallest details, like a fog on a window when the raptor breathes. Just a little subtle camera shake when a footstep comes down. Phenomenal sound design. A soundtrack that would just help us just elevate the audience into just believing that what we were seeing. I think that sometimes movies will suffer from we'll fix this in post, or we'll do this in post, or the CG guys can just figure this all out, and it ends up being a situation where we believe it less than we do of this movie that was filmed 25 years ago. I did a little research into it. It's like, well, what computer would my family have had during that time? It would have been one of the old 486 computers, right? Because anybody that was buying a Pentium, I mean, it came out that year. The first Pentium computer came out the year that Jurassic Park came out. So they couldn't throw a bunch of computer horsepower at this. They had to just throw really effective filmmaking technique at this movie, and it paid off, and it continues to pay off.
I completely agree with you that Jurassic Park should be a great revisit for any filmmaker wondering how they should handle their CG to practical. It's dependent on the characters, and I think that's definitely something that people should take away from this film.
I think this is, I think to sum up what both of you are saying, this is a gold standard of blockbuster filmmaking, and working with the technology you have and making sure you sell everything you're putting on screen. So I think this is probably a great place to kind of wrap this up. Yeah.
Any last thoughts, Taylor?
Oh, just going back to your ink to film theme here, I think that any writer in the world would be really, really lucky to have a book developed with this degree of care. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. It's a dream.
Yeah, that's it. That's the dream. That someone's going to care that much about your book, that they're going to put that much time and effort into it.
So we've been ending with a certain question. Basically, would you go to Jurassic Park? But I think knowing your record and knowing what you've done in your life, I assume that you would go. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I've been 3 miles deep to the bottom of the ocean. I think Jurassic Park is. I would definitely do it. The way I look at it is, you don't have to outrun the dinosaurs. You just got to outrun the slower tourists.
So I'm actually going to have a slightly different question for you that I'm going to save for the end here. But before we get to that, I want you to go ahead, if you're willing, to let our listeners know where they can find you, where they can find your book, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you'll put a link up in the show notes. Best way to check me out is my website, TaylorZajonc.com. That's Zajonc, believe it or not. You can find my latest book, The Maw, in basically online or any major book retailer. It's if you're a fan of Crichton, I think you're going to really like this one.
And I agree with that. Absolutely made me think of Crichton just from reading that little bit that I just got the book. But so that comes around to my question. So my question is going to be a little different. It's going to be, you are contacted by an organization that wants you to come to a newly discovered cave, and in this cave they have found living dinosaurs. I know, unbelievable. But the whole point is they want to put together a trip to go down into this cave and investigate. Would you do that?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. I have to say...
and they are offering good money. I will say the pay is good.
my whole kind of metric on what I'll do and what I won't do has changed a lot since having a kid. I've got a 2-year-old. Sure. He's just amazing. The Maw is dedicated to him. Sold the motorcycle. A lot of changes made. But I gotta say, it's hard to say no to an expedition. I think I'd do it.
I love it. I'm going anyway.
Well, you got to bring him with, right?
Well, he's got to be at least 6.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Taylor. It's been awesome talking about this movie with you.
Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, guys. This was a blast.
So last week we announced that our next project is going to be American Psycho, which I'm very excited for. But I forgot to mention that we're actually going to be taking 1 week off. I'm going to the In Your Right Mind workshop, or In Your Right Mind conference, just outside of Pittsburgh in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. I'm going to be teaching a course there. I'm going to be on a couple of panels. So if anybody is in that area and wants to come see me, it's at Seton Hill University. And it's several days long, and I'll be there for the whole event. But because of that, we're going to take 1 week off. So the last week of June, there won't be an episode, and then we'll be back in the first week of July.
So we recently started a Patreon, and we're basically just doing it to ensure that this show continues for the foreseeable future. We really enjoy bringing you this content, and we just wanted to try to find a way to interact more with our patrons. So if you could go ahead and check that out, it's patreon.com/ink2film.
Yeah, we greatly appreciate it. We wanted to go ahead and shout out one of our patrons, Ben E. He's been along with us from the beginning, like many of our patrons. He's been a supporter, and we really appreciate his support. Once again, this is not like no pressure. You don't have to do this or anything. But if you're willing to check it out and you're thinking that there's something you'd like to do to help us, it would be greatly appreciated. The other thing you could do if you don't want to spend any money but you wanted to help the show is to leave a rating and a review on whatever podcast app you use to listen. iTunes is especially helpful. So yeah, that just helps us get visibility and get more listeners.
If you wanted to connect with us in any other way, we are on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. It's all at ink2film, and we're really active on there.
Yeah, and we just wanted to thank Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music. And we wanted to thank Taylor Zajonc again for coming on. He's an amazing writer with amazing world experience, and you should definitely check out his books. The Maw is the most recent one. Definitely check that out, and thank you to Taylor for coming on.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to checking it out. Thank you so much, Taylor. Really appreciate it.
And lastly, thank you all for listening. That's going to be it for Jurassic Park. It's been a really fun project and exciting, and it's funny because it's another Spielberg project, and I know we're going to return to him soon. So he's becoming a staple of this thing going forward. But it's been a lot of fun.
He's a legend, so I'm glad that we get a chance to talk about his material in addition to some of the people that he's adapted.
And that's going to be it then. Until next time, I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
See ya.